meine Kommilitonen, deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein.
A devastated, poor, and humiliated Germany after World War I. Hyperinflation and unemployment. Political extremism and violence. The rise and fall of Germany's first democracy. Hyper-anti-Semitism, myths, and conspiracy theories. The birth of the Jewish question. Un-German ideas and ideologies ranging from Marxism, the proto-sexual revolution, and pacifism, to liberalism and leftism. Jewish intellectualism as an issue to be dealt with, the campaign Action Against the Un-German Spirit as a solution. University students and Nazi officials orchestrated everything. The looting of institutes, the symbolic burnings, the fire oaths, the 12 Theses, the blacklist, the reasoning behind it, the authors to be censored, the books to be burned. The National Socialist Book Burnings, a documentary. By Hysterismus. Before we start, I want to clarify that this video aims to educate and encourage critical thinking. We'll explore historical events, explanations, circumstances, opinions, concepts, contemporary documents, analysis by experts, and more, all based on a variety of sources which will be appearing on the bottom right of your screens. My goal is to foster constructive dialogue among viewers of all perspectives. These are the topics we'll be discussing today. Feel free to pause the video and take a closer look. To give a heads up, we'll start talking about the physical burning of books around halfway through the video. I hope you find the context and ideas behind the book burnings just as interesting as the physical burnings themselves. Context. During World War I, a staggering 2,037,000 German soldiers lost their lives on the battlefield fighting a war they would lose. This immense loss of life not only constituted a military tragedy, but also had a profound impact on German society, which rippled across the political, social, economic, and cultural fabric of the nation. The Treaty of Versailles marked the end of the Second Reich and ushered in a new era for Germany, characterized by the establishment of the Weimar Republic in 1918, Germany's first democracy, the stage for most of our story. Actually, let's take a look at the timeline of Germany and place the book burnings on it. Our timeline starts in 1918 with the end of World War I and finishes in 1939 with the start of World War II. Let's now divide it between the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany. Not surprisingly, the year 1933 marks the start of the book burnings, and on May of that same year, the main event of our video takes place in Berlin's Bebelplatz. But we'll talk a lot more about it as we continue. Lastly, let's zoom out and see both the German Empire and Allied-occupied Germany. As you can see, the former ceased to exist at the end of World War I, and the latter came to exist at the end of World War II. Back to the interwar period, hyperinflation and unemployment defined Germany's economy after their defeat in World War I. On top of the reparations imposed by the Allies through the Treaty of Versailles, which also imposed demilitarization zones, disarmament, and territorial changes on the Germans. Hence, the clauses of this treaty, quote, reduced the once proud German military to practically nothing and placed all blame for the war on Germany. Again, on top of these, the Great Depression helped worsen the economy further and accelerate the fall of the Weimar Republic, which we'll talk about in a moment. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the idea of a stab in the back by certain groups of people, like socialists, communists, and Jews, grew in popularity. Paul von Hindenburg, who led the Imperial German Army during the war and would go on to become the president, claimed that revolutionary forces had sabotaged the German military and caused its collapse. He claimed all this in front of a parliamentary committee that was investigating the causes of the German defeat. In fact, there were precedents of these types of ideas during the war when a Judenseelung, or count of Jews, was introduced by the German government due to a supposed lack of patriotism among Jews in the army. For those who don't speak German, the panel in the back reads, "Without a solution to the Jewish question, there is no salvation for the German people." We'll add just one more thing which is particularly relevant to our topic. In the 19th century, a lot before the Nazi Party was even formed, some philosophers, theologians, writers, and other thinkers grappled with what they labeled the Jewish question. The viewer might have heard of it before, but let's formally define it considering the context of our video. The Jewish question posited that the presence of a Jewish minority in society is a problem that requires a solution. Beginning in the 19th century, the status of European Jews became the subject of heated debate, precisely in the era when they were gradually being granted civil rights and equality. During this time, there were, so to speak, two schools of thought regarding this issue. Those who expected Jews to adapt or abandon their customs, behaviors, traditions, and even their religious beliefs in order to assimilate into society, and those who denied that conversion or acculturation were real solutions to the Jewish question. Rather, they believed that Jews were a separate race, whose behavior, traits, and character were negative and unchangeable. One of the many manifestations of this issue is, of course, the book burnings. The failure of the Weimar Republic can be attributed to a multitude of factors, among which economic decline played a pivotal role. Faced with dire economic circumstances, many Germans turned to political extremism as a means of finding solutions to their grievances. This fertile ground for radical ideologies laid the foundation for the rise of extremist movements, both to the left and to the right, including, of course, the Nazi Party. Historian James Harold argues that there exists a clear link between economic decline and people turning to extremist politics. As a recap, we have established the three following ideas so far. One, that the Weimar Republic replaced the German Empire, and it would be replaced itself later by the Nazis. In precisely the same year, 1933, the book burnings began. Two, that the standard anti-Semitism of the time, because of conspiracy theories, myths of betrayal, race essentialism, and other things, one of which we will introduce soon as Jewish intellectualism. Again, the standard anti-Semitism of the time morphed into what I have labeled hyper-anti-Semitism. And three, that many Germans were pushed into political extremism by the context in which they lived, as we have just explained now. We have set the stage for our story. Let's quickly see what's coming in chapters 2 and 3. In chapter 2, we'll present Marxism, the proto-sexual revolution, and pacifism, three so-called un-German ideas commonly associated with the book burnings. We'll come back to the concept of un-German ideas later, though I suspect the viewer may intuit what it means. To finish chapter 2, we'll briefly define what Jewish intellectualism is and what it meant specifically in the context of the Weimar Republic. From chapter 3 to the end of our video, we'll take a deep dive into the book Burnings, discussing the protagonists, their inspiration, the 12 Theses, the occupation of the Institute for Sexual Science, the many burnings that took place throughout the country, our main event in Berlin's Bebelplatz Square, Joseph Goebbels' speech, the fire oaths, the books burned, the blacklist, the authors. We'll come back to the idea of Jewish intellectualism and present a testimony. Un-German ideas. Let's present and briefly discuss three un-German ideas. These are not only the more interesting ones, but also those overrepresented in the books burned. Discussing the burnings without this prior discussions of these un-German ideas would leave a little too much for the imagination or intuition. First, let's address the question we are all thinking of. Were the National Socialist German Workers' Party actually socialist? It would be strange if they were, as they burned Marxist socialist books. Let's first hear it from the horse's mouth and understand what the Nazis meant by socialism, which diverged significantly from our modern understanding of the term, and, in fact, also differed from the understanding of most people in his time. In a revealing 1923 interview by George Sylvester Viereck, a young 34-year-old Hitler states his view on socialism. Let's narrate it as it appeared in Liberty magazine when it was published.
Why, I asked Hitler, do you call yourself a National Socialist, since your party program is the very antithesis of that commonly accredited to socialism? Socialism, he retorted, putting down his cup of tea pugnaciously, is the science of dealing with the common weal. Communism is not socialism. Marxism is not socialism. The Marxians have stolen the term and confused its meaning. I shall take socialism away from the socialists. Socialism is an ancient Aryan, Germanic institution. Our German ancestors held certain lands in common. They cultivated the idea of the common weal. Marxism has no right to disguise itself as socialism. Socialism, unlike Marxism, does not repudiate private property. Unlike Marxism, it involves no negation of personality, and unlike Marxism, it is patriotic. We might have called ourselves the Liberal Party. We chose to call ourselves the National Socialists. We are not internationalists. Our socialism is national. We demand the fulfillment of the just claims of the productive classes by the state on the basis of race solidarity. To us, state and race are one.
The Nazis occupied a peculiar ideological place in this regard. Let's conclude this issue by listening to Dr. Eric Kurlander. In regards to the basis for the Nazi ideology, he says it was an outgrowth of prior traditions in Germany and Austria in the late 19th century, which, as he puts it,
recognized that free market capitalism, which they associated with Jews, wasn't solving the problems of modernity, of industrial society. On the other hand, Marxist socialism, which they also associated with Jews, seemed to be non-national, non-patriotic, open to all races and creeds in a way that they just could not accept. And so you get a lot of these conservative revolutionaries or right-wing anti-Semitic, socially inclined political reformers who formed their own parties in the 1880s and 90s, often with the centerpiece being racism and anti-Semitism. The idea that if somehow the Jewish control of society could be eliminated, then Germans or Austrians or other Europeans could get along, do productive work, not eliminate private property, but moderate capitalism for the lower middle classes, the small businessman, the farmer. So that's a long tradition in Central Europe, and the Nazis are the heirs to that tradition. They weren't really inventing anything new.
Finally, he concludes as follows.
So that's the tradition. It's this kind of an attempt to split the difference between capitalism and socialism by uniting people around race and ethnicity and language, instead of left-wing Marxism on the one hand or free market Anglo-Saxon liberalism and capitalism on the other, which was also seen as materialist and Jewish and cosmopolitan.
There is quite a lot more to be said on this issue, but we have enough now to justify why the Nazis burned Marxist literature, whether it be strictly academic works or novels with underlying political messages, as we'll see later on. The proto-sexual revolution was a cultural phenomenon that took place in many European cities in the late 19th, early 20th century. Throughout Europe, cities like Paris and London were at the forefront of it, and though these cities challenged the status quo in sexual issues, the epicenter was Berlin, especially during the years of the Weimar Republic. Best put by Ruth Rohlig, a contemporary writer in 1928.
While in the past, London, and especially Paris, were spoken of as the cities of mysterious pleasures, Berlin has long since surpassed them. Here, everyone has the opportunity to be blissfully happy according to his or her own desires. Every taste is catered for, even those of the so-called outsiders of love.
Historian Julia Ross indicates that during this time period in the Weimar Republic, as elsewhere in interwar Europe, anxiety-ridden discourses about sexual disorder and moral decay became potent political forces, referencing homosexuality, transgenderism, prostitution, promiscuity, sexual exploration, and so on. The capital saw a gradual shift towards greater acceptance and tolerance of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgenders. No institution helps illustrate this cultural shift better than the Institute for Sexual Science, founded by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld in 1919. There is a lot to be said on the Institute and the proto-sexual revolution in the 1920s, but I'll save it for another video. For now, let's just mention a couple of things about it. The Institute for Sexual Science witnessed the first sex reassignment surgeries, from the first one in history to the most popular one at the time. The Institute fought against paragraph 175, which, among other things, criminalized homosexual sexual relations. It provided counseling and treatment for physical and psychological sexual disorders, as well as, in particular, for, quote, sexual transitions. More than 40 people worked at the Institute in fields like research, sexual counseling, treatment of venereal diseases, and public sex education. It also housed the main offices of both the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the first homosexual organization, and the World League for Sexual Reform. Even though many had a favorable view of the Institute, it was denounced by others as Jewish, social democratic, and offensive for public morals from its very beginning. It's important to highlight the Institute as it'll be our starting point when we get into the book burnings. This proto-sexual revolution was received well by many, which doesn't need much explanation, especially for the modern viewer. However, just like with the Institute, there was a lot of pushback at the time. So let's read what two contemporary authors who visited Berlin had to say about it. Notice the mention of Magnus's Institute and its books not being censored.
Quite naturally, if the uncensored publications issued by the Institute and other publishers belong to the realm of culture, then Hitler should be severely condemned for retarding the progress of civilization. On the other hand, if culture and pornography are synonymous, as was undoubtedly the case in pre-Nazi Germany, then for the sake of Christian civilization and the moral health of coming generations, it would be much safer to abolish culture. With the Institute, supported by many other sources, turning out pornographic magazines and books, it was only natural that the public should be supplied with places where all this culture could be put into practice. The corrupt administration of the cities did not censure the Institute, so why should it forbid pervert clubs, homosexuality leagues, or daisy bars?
Pre-Hitler Berlin was a sink of iniquity. The fingers of any moderately fussy patriot must have itched to spring clean it. Its male prostitutes alone, with their India rubber breasts and padded hips, the fairy hostesses of El Dorado, were a standing invitation to the Puritan to organize a march on Berlin.
Historian Julia Roos argues that the Nazis' successful attempt to portray themselves as determined purifiers of public morality played a vital role in their ultimate political success, a factor largely neglected in the existing scholarship on Nazism. On May 6, 1933, Magnus's Institute for Sexual Science was occupied by the German Student Union, who were a collective of Nazi-supporting university students, and, as we'll talk more later, the protagonists of many of the book burnings. Several days later, the entire contents of the library were removed to Berlin's Bebelplatz Square, where the most infamous book burning of history took place. Being a homosexual, sexual liberation activist, pacifist Jew, Magnus and his institute were subject to many attacks, culminating in his departure from Germany and his institute being closed as the Nazi regime rose to power. Again, we'll come back to all this later on when we discuss the burnings themselves. Finally, while it is true that not all the prominent and influential figures of this proto-sexual revolution in the Weimar Republic were Jewish, it is true that many popular ones were in fact Jewish. We'll discuss this idea more when we talk about Jewish intellectualism, the fire oaths, and the blacklist. Let's now move on to pacifism. Historian Richard Bessel states that it remains one of the most telling characteristics of the political culture of interwar Germany, referring to both the Weimar Republic and Nazi Germany, that pacifism failed to make a significant impact after so awful and senseless an armed conflict, referring to World War I. From journalists and politicians to feminists and scientists, many people voiced their support for pacifism, especially during the Weimar Republic. Perhaps the two most notable pacifists from this time in Germany were Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote the book that would later inspire the movie by the same name, All Quiet on the Western Front, in which he depicted his experiences during World War I, and scientist Albert Einstein, who, even though he despised militarism and the use of force, in an interview in 1931 he said, "I am not only a pacifist, but a militant pacifist. I believe the viewer doesn't need a lot of imagination to think of reasons why the Germans specifically would gravitate towards pacifistic ideas after World War I. The contrary, however, deserves more explanation. Let's first hear it from the horse's mouth, and then give a more specific and academic explanation. Let's see how Hitler, and therefore the Nazi Party, justified war in a general sense. Taken from his book Mein Kampf. Now it is unfortunately true that only too often the best nations, or to speak more exactly, the only really cultured nations, who at the same time are the chief bearers of human progress, have decided, in their blind pacifism, to refrain from the acquisition of new territory and to be content with internal colonization. But at the same time, nations of inferior quality succeed in getting hold of large spaces for colonization all over the globe. The state of affairs which must result from this contrast is the following. Races which are culturally superior but less ruthless would be forced to restrict their increase because of insufficient territory to support the population, while less civilized races could increase indefinitely, owing to the vast territories at their disposal. In other words, should that state of affairs continue, then the world will one day be possessed by that portion of mankind which is culturally inferior but more active and energetic. Let's read one last extract on this issue. The pacifist humanitarian idea may indeed become an excellent one when the most superior type of manhood will have succeeded in subjugating the world to such an extent that this type is then sole master of the earth. This idea could have an injurious effect only in the measure according to which its application would become difficult and finally impossible. So, first of all, the fight and then pacifism. If the case were different, it would mean that mankind has already passed the zenith of its development, and accordingly, the end would not be the supremacy of some moral ideal, but degeneration into barbarism and consequent chaos. Let's now be more specific. It is also true that Hitler had a desire to reunify the German peoples, which he would achieve through the pursuit of what is now known as Lebensraum, literally living space in English. This living space would enable Germans to become economically self-sufficient and militarily secure. Such goals were greeted with support by many within Germany, who, as we already know, heavily resented the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Through various means, he was able to annex Austria and Czechoslovakia with little resistance in 1938 and 1939. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, which had been guaranteed French and British military support should such an event occur. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, both countries declared war on Germany, launching the largest and most violent military conflict in human history, World War II. These are the most popular so-called un-German ideas. I trust the viewer will get a better picture when we discuss the book burnings themselves in the next chapter. Let's quickly tackle our last issue. I'll be working on another video discussing the so-called Jewish intellectualism in the Weimar Republic. For now, I'll just present 3 ideas. 1. That German Jews in the Weimar Republic were generally prosperous, with an insubstantial number of them as industrial workers. Also, Jews had developed an intellectual tradition which combined, among other things, respect for prior precedent and disruptive thinking. This is one of the many reasons why they were, and are to this date, overrepresented in intellectual endeavors. 2. There was an informal alliance between Jews and the political left. Not all Jews and not all leftist groups, of course. This alliance in Europe covered most of the 19th and 20th century. More precisely, the engagement of Jews with the left reached its peak from approximately 1890 to 1950, covering the entirety of the Weimar Republic. And 3, an outstanding feature of the Weimar Republic was the polarization between the unprecedented integration of Jews in every sphere of life, and the growth of political anti-Semitism among various organizations and political parties, especially in the immediate post-war years, for which we have already presented reasons in the context chapter. I'm working on another video on this issue, where I'll go into a lot more detail on these three ideas and will give many examples of such phenomena in the political, cultural, and social realms. Let's talk about the book burnings. Against the un-German spirit. Let's start off by mentioning the protagonists of these burnings and their inspiration. In early 1933, the Nazi Party ascended to power in Germany, finding support among university students and faculty. The Deutsche Studentenschaft, or German Student Union in English, emerged as a prominent force, advocating for nationalist and anti-Semitic ideals within academic institutions, proclaiming a nationwide action against the un-German spirit. The book-burning campaign had begun. These young men were inspired by a historical event that took place in 1817 when the German student associations of the time decided to commemorate the 300th year anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses written in 1517 and hold a festival at the Wartburg Castle, the place where Luther had sought sanctuary after his excommunication. There, over 500 students and teachers gathered to protest against reactionary politics and the mini-state system they had back then, pushing for a German nation-state with its own constitution. By the end of the festival, many books were burned, from the Napoleonic Code to the History of the German Reich, alongside other anti-nationalist and reactionary texts and literature that were deemed un-German. The German Student Union, in reference to Luther's 95 Theses, came up with 12 theses of their own, which were distributed with the support of the Ministry of Propaganda. Let's glance over these 12 theses by translating some of this leaflet under the title of Against the Un-German Spirit. From 1933 it reads, "It is the German folk's responsibility to assure that its language and literature are the pure and unadulterated expression of its folk traditions. Our most dangerous enemy is the Jew and those who are his slaves. We want to regard the Jew as alien, and we want to respect the traditions of the folk. Therefore, we demand of the censor, Jewish writings are to be published in Hebrew. If they appear in German, they must be identified as translations. We demand of German students the desire and capability to overcome Jewish intellectualism and the resulting liberal decay in the German spirit. A Jew can only think Jewish. If he writes in German, he is lying. The German who writes in German but thinks un-German is a traitor. We want to eradicate lies. We want to denounce treason. We want institutions of discipline and political education for us, the students, not mindlessness. And finally, we demand the selection of students and professors in accordance with their reliability and commitment to the German spirit." Notice the use of the word folk, in German, Volk. According to Hitler, the natural unit of mankind was the folk, the people, of which the German was the greatest, and the state existed only to serve the folk, a mission that the Weimar Republic, according to the Nazis, had betrayed. In this regard, historian Henry Turner indicates that the word Volk in this context connotes ethnic homogeneity, and that being a German is a matter of ancestry. One can become a German only by being born one. No one else can belong to the Volk. The book burnings of 1933. Prelude. Occupation of the Institute for Sexual Science. Jewish, gay, pacifist, and outspokenly liberal, Hirschfeld was an obvious target for the Nazis. The Einstein of Sex and the Institute of Sexual Science he founded were the perfect representations of the so-called Jewish intellectualism, an archetype that would only be intensified by the influence Dr. Hirschfeld had on culture in general, from founding leagues, committees, institutes, and giving speeches internationally, to co-directing movies and his extensive academic work on sexual issues. all of which, to the Nazi Party and its sympathizers, were responsible for spreading un-German ideas. The Institute faced its demise shortly after Hitler assumed the position of Chancellor in January of 1933. On May 6th of the same year, Nazi-supporting university students affiliated with the German Student Union, alongside SA members, seized and occupied the Institute's premises. Subsequently, on May 10th, the Institute's library collection was forcefully removed to Berlin's Babelplatz Square, setting the stage for one of the most infamous book burnings in history. An American newspaper described the event 4 days after the looting took place.
A priceless collection of medical books from Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute were seized but may be saved.
Followed by,
all books of a socialist, Jewish, or pacifist trend are especially marked for destruction.
Here's an interesting question. What did the average American in the 1930s think books of Jewish trend were? At the beginning of April 1933, the German Student Union proclaimed a nationwide action against the un-German spirit throughout German universities, as we've mentioned a moment ago. The aim was to remove undesirable professors from their posts, to blacklist un-German books, and to purify libraries according to National Socialist principles. The campaign reached its climax on the night of May 10, 1933, when students in over 20 university towns across Germany marched in torchlight parades to public book burnings. Prior to the actions of the German students, book burnings were actually already underway in the German Reich. Organized by the SA, the Sturmabteilung, SS, the Schutzstaffel, and HJ, Hitler Youth, flags and books were burned in school patios in cities like Berlin, Dusseldorf, Flensburg, Pirna, and Wuppertal during March and April of 1933, before our main event. And even after it, such acts of destruction were carried out again and again. However, it was our main event, the Berlin book burning on Babelplatz Square, that received unparalleled attention for propaganda purposes. The event was broadcast on radio, filmed, and later showcased in German cinemas. Tens of thousands of people gathered for the event and listened to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, as we'll do now. The book-burning event that unfolded on the night of May 10, 1933, in Berlin's Babelplatz Square stands as the most infamous symbolic book-burning event in history. Over 50,000 people gathered, including professors, students, Nazi officials, and the general public, to participate in the condemnation of works written by Jews, liberals, Marxists, pacifists, leftists, and all others deemed un-German. Under the watchful eyes of German Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, upwards of 25,000 volumes were cast into the flames. Let's now listen to an extract from Goebbels' speech.
Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels spricht zur Jugend. Meine Kommilitonen, deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der Durchbruch der deutschen Revolution hat auf dem deutschen Weg wieder die Gasse freigemacht. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und dazu wollen wir euch erziehen. Jung schon den Mut zu haben, dem Leben in die erbarmungslosen Augen hineinzuschauen. Die Furcht vor dem Tode zu verlernen, um vor dem Tode wieder Ehrfurcht zu bekommen. Das ist die Aufgabe dieses jungen Geschlechts. Und deshalb tu dir gut daran, um diese mitternächtige Stunde den Ungeist der Vergangenheit, den Flammen anzuvertrauen. Das ist eine starke, große und symbolische Handlung. Eine Handlung, die vor aller Welt dokumentieren soll. Hier sinkt die geistige Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
The day before the scheduled book burnings, so May 9, 1933, the German Student Association sent out a circular that contained statements to be read as books were tossed to the flames, the fire oaths. These would accompany the burning of works written by the individual authors named in the statements. Let's read all of them. 1. Against class struggle and materialism, for national community and an idealistic lifestyle, Marx and Kautsky. 2. Against decadence and moral decay, for discipline and decency in family and state, Heinrich Mann, Ernst Glaser, and Erich Kästner. 3. Against opportunism and political betrayal, for devotion to nation and state, Friedrich Wilhelm Foerster. 4. Against soul-shredding overvaluation of sexual activity, for the nobility of the human soul, Freudian School. 5. Against the falsification of our history and disparagement of its great figures, for reverence for our past, Emil Ludwig and Werner Hegemann. 6. Against the democratic Jewish character of journalism alien to the nation, for responsible collaboration on the work of national construction, Theodor Wolff and Georg Bernhard. 7. Against literary betrayal of the soldiers of the World War, for the education of the nation in the spirit of standing to battle, Erich Maria Remarque. 8. Against the arrogant corruption of the German language, for the cultivation of the most precious possession of our nation, Alfred Kerr. 9. Against impudence and presumption, for veneration and reverence for the immortal German national spirit, Tucholsky and Ossietzky. We'll come back to some of these authors when we discuss the blacklist. For now, I would like to point out the fact that 7 out of the 15 authors mentioned in the fire oaths were Jewish. These were Marx, Freud, Ludwig, Wolff, Bernhard, Kerr, and Tucholsky. In 1933, Jews represented less than 1%, so approximately 500,000 people, of the total population of Germany. Considering that Marx had died 5 decades before this estimation, and that Freud and Kautsky were Austrians, the prominence of Jews in these so-called un-German ideas becomes evident, at least amongst the authors considered to be particularly influential in the German Student Union's estimation. Granted, they might have been biased. We'll have one more example like this when we discuss the blacklist in a moment. Anyway, what books were burned? Let's mention some of the most notable books that fell victim to the flames during the book burnings in Nazi Germany. To start, let's mention those looted from Dr. Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. Berlin's Third Sex by Magnus Hirschfeld. Transvestites, The Erotic Drive to Crossdress by Magnus Hirschfeld, and The Homosexuality of Men and Women, also by Magnus Hirschfeld. The Marquis de Sade and His Times by Ivan Bloch, a very popular Jewish collaborator for the Institute, often called the first sexologist. Also, the Institute housed a vast array of scientific documents, with over 40 individuals working across various fields, including research, sexual counseling, treatment of venereal diseases, public sex education, etc. To represent the kind of works to be found in the Institute, let's point to the Yearbook for Intermediate Sexual Types, which featured articles on scientific, literary, and political topics related to sexual and gender minorities, with many notable contributors, but that's an issue for another video. On to Marxist literature, we have The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, The Class Struggle by Karl Kautsky, The Accumulation of Capital by Rosa Luxemburg, and Woman and Socialism by August Bebel. We have books labeled pacifist, such as A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, Class of 1902 by Ernst Glaser, and All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. Other books deemed un-German include The German Republic by Thomas Mann, Unmasked History by Werner Hegemann, and Man and the Masses by Ernst Toller. Books that, at first hand, one wouldn't find a reason why they were burned. Titles like The Foundation of the Generalized Theory of Relativity by Albert Einstein, and even Bambi by Felix Salten. Lastly, some of the most notable authors whose works, or at least some of them, were burned to include Jack London, Franz Kafka, Victor Hugo, Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Herbert George Wells, André Gide, and many others. The censorship of seemingly innocuous books was driven by a combination of factors, including the author's Jewish identity, perceived and real political affiliations of the authors, and even the potential for hidden allegorical messages that ran counter to Nazi ideology, or supposedly Jewish-influenced abstract mathematics.
Hitler orders all blacklist books burned.
But what exactly is blacklist books referring to? Let's meet Dr. Wolfgang Herrmann. He had been a member of the Nazi Party since 1931 and had worked on a blacklist of writings that were to be prohibited from borrowing in public libraries and bookstores, and that would gradually be discarded altogether. It is important to note that the German Student Union asked for Dr. Herrmann's list to have as a reference, so the original purpose wasn't to enact book burnings based on them. Let's take a look now at another primary source. Let me quickly point out first that digging yourself through primary sources, especially those of World War II, for example, of the Nazi regime that had a Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, is a sophisticated endeavor that requires a nuanced understanding of the historical context, being able to analytically engage with the material and other theoretical, pragmatic, and ethical considerations. Needless to say, I myself am a qualified person, so let's jump right into it. Let's see a version of the so-called blacklist, published on May 16, 1933. It reads, Principles for Cleaning Public Libraries by Dr. Wolfgang Herrmann, Berlin. The task assigned to the public library, Volksbücherei, in the new state corresponds to Mussolini's slogan, Books and rifles, that is my command. This means that the cultural political goal of the public libraries is the intellectual defense, the total mobilization of the German people with the help of genuine literature. The first step towards this goal is the spontaneous attempt initiated everywhere to concentrate the resources and book collections of the libraries on the essentials. This process, which took place in an orderly fashion wherever experts took the action into their own hands, soon became known to the general public through the inquisitorial catchword, blacklists. This was never about iconoclasm, but more than so, namely the development of new principles of choice and value in the field of popular literature and literary criticism. The standards according to which the blacklists were drawn up are, of course, of a literary political nature. They are based on the fundamental preliminary question necessary for every political decision: who is the real enemy? Against whom is the fight directed? It continues, the answer is provided by a fundamental declaration which has been recognized by the Prussian Ministry of Science, Art, and National Education and declared binding for the state library authorities in the country. This declaration states, the fight is directed against the disintegration phenomenon of our species-bound form of thinking and living, i.e., against the asphalt literature, which is primarily written for the metropolitan man in order to strengthen and completely uproot him in his lack of relationship to the environment, to the people, and to every community. It is the literature of intellectual nihilism. The final blacklist had categories like beautiful literature, history, art, politics and political science, literary history and religion, pedagogy, and philosophy. Dr. Wolfgang Herrmann forwarded the categories of beautiful literature and politics and political science to the German student body at the beginning of May 1933, which they used as the basis for looting of libraries and scientific institutions in the campaign against the un-German spirit. So let's take a look at one of them, the beautiful literature category, referring to writings that are beautiful and pleasing in an artistic way, rather than being very serious or full of information. I suspect the viewer might be more interested in this cultural aspect, so let's wrap up our video going over some authors on this list. If we take a closer look at the list of authors, the viewer can see a little cross drawn next to some of them, This means that, quote, they must be regarded as the real pests, which the book trade should also try to eradicate. Let's quickly meet who were these authors in the beautiful literature category. Leon Feuchtwanger, a Jewish novelist and playwright who wrote about Jewish themes in his early fiction, taking a leftist political turn after World War I, and would finally go on to write the famous anti-Nazi book, The Oppermans. Ernst Gleser, a dramatist and journalist whose books were considered leftist and anti-fascist. His most popular novel, Class of 1902, which we have labeled as pacifist earlier, earned him a prominent place among social democratic authors. Arthur Holitscher, a former banker born to a middle-class Jewish family in Austria-Hungary. Later in his life, he would become a radical pacifist and socialist during the Russian Revolution. During this time, he was a representative of the Workers' and Soldiers' Council, a member of the Council of Intellectual Workers, and co-founder of the Proletarian Theater in Berlin. Alfred Kerr, a German Jew who was one of the most widely read theater critics of the Weimar Republic. Not too keen on the Nazis, he said, Hitler, this is the mob that read Nietzsche. Egon Kisch, a Jewish journalist and communist born to an owner of a textile shop. Kisch's publications and accounts of trips to the Soviet Union, all written from the communist point of view, established his reputation as a successful and influential writer throughout Germany. Emil Ludwig, a Jewish journalist and biographer. Ludwig wrote what were considered to be controversial biographies, articles critical of Nazi rule, and he would also actively assist fellow intellectuals seeking to flee Germany during the Nazi regime. Heinrich Mann, an author despised by the Nazis not only for his writing, but also for his political actions, most notably his attempts to reconcile France and Germany, and to effect a coalition between Social Democrats and Communists in order to prevent the rise of Adolf Hitler. Ernst Ottwalt, a novelist and essayist who became one of the best-known German communist writers. He was an active member in the League of Proletarian Revolutionary Writers in Berlin. With the rise of Nazism in 1933, he went to Moscow where he wrote for a communist magazine. Years later, he was accused of espionage for Germany and banished to the Gulag, where he died in 1943. Theodore Pliévier, a German war novelist who fought in World War I and described his experiences through his many books. In the 1920s, Pliévier worked as a left-wing publicist. Erich Maria Remarque, a German novelist we've already discussed. He wrote the book All Quiet on the Western Front. Kurt Tucholsky, a German Jewish satirical essayist, poet, and critic. In his work, he criticized German militarism and nationalism. He contributed to Rote Signale, a collection of communist poetry, and to Schaubühne, a journal published by the pacifist journalist Karl von Ossietzky. Lastly, Stefan Zweig, an Austrian Jewish writer whose most famous work was inspired by Sigmund Freud's work. To mention one more thing, both Kurt Tucholsky and Stefan Zweig fled their native countries during the Nazis' rise to power. Both of them would commit suicide in Sweden and Brazil, respectively. 7 out of these 12 particularly un-German authors in the beautiful literature category were of Jewish descent. Once again, Jews are overrepresented here, at least in Dr. Herman's estimation, which, granted, might have been biased against the Jews. The overrepresentation of Jewish authors, both in the category of beautiful literature in the blacklist and in the fire oaths in relation to the demographics at the time, alongside the justifications given for both Jewish overrepresentation in intellectual endeavors and their unofficial allegiance to the left during this time period, coupled also with the examples I have given of this phenomenon in the Weimar Republic and what I have called hyper-anti-Semitism. Again, all of this helps illustrate the coining of the term Jewish intellectualism and the relationship between it and so-called un-German ideas. Both of these concepts have been instrumental to understanding the book burnings, the context around these events, and the reasoning behind them. Conclusion. Here's the takeaway of our video. The book burnings were mostly symbolic acts that were also mostly part of a broader campaign called Action Against the Un-German Spirit. And while it is true that establishing a relationship between Jewish intellectualism and un-German ideas is not the main idea of this video, it does help understand these burnings better, especially as it relates to the targeting of works by Jews. This ties as a main component to the hyper-anti-Semitism of the time, which, when examined within the context of our video, also sheds some light on the broader spectrum of actions enacted by the Nazis and the sentiments shared by many of its sympathizers. That being said, the book burnings were directed against un-German ideas, as we've discussed throughout this video, and not solely against works by Jewish authors. However, it's important to recognize that the overlap was significant. Many of these so-called un-German ideas were indeed penned by Jewish writers. This unfortunate coincidence, along other things we've mentioned and many other we haven't had time to discuss, highlights the anti-Semitic undercurrents of the time, where Jewish intellectuals were disproportionately targeted, whether for their ideas, their identity, or both. I hope that the content of this video, both perspectives and facts, has shed some light on the National Socialist book burnings. If you've made it this far into the video, let me tell you that this is actually a one-man job. The names at the start of the video were just to give some gravitas to the whole thing. This is the very first video I'm making, so I would really appreciate it if you could take the extra step and comment down below your thoughts on the video, the topic, the research, the editing, the music, and so on. Consider joining my Patreon if you liked this video and would like to see more and better content like this.
Funeral weather hung over the city. The head of a battered bust of Magnus Hirschfeld was perched on a long pole that swayed back and forth high above the silent crowd. It was disgusting. Suddenly, a shrill female voice called out, "It says Kessner there." A young female cabaret artist, who was squeezing through the crowd with a colleague, had seen me standing there and expressed her astonishment excessively loudly. I felt uneasy, but nothing happened, although a lot used to happen these days. The books continued to fly into the fire. You weren't a prophet if you predicted these and similar events in satirical verses. The fact that no errors could occur was due to the subject matter, the character of the Germans. Of course, the satirist must know the subject of